The alarms never sounded when the galaxy decided to abandon humanity. There was no warning broadcast, no ultimatum delivered by an angry alien envoy, no dramatic declaration in the halls of the Galactic Council. One moment the stars still answered human signals, and the next they went silent, as if the universe itself had turned its back. Cargo lanes vanished from navigation maps, quantum relays stopped responding, automated trade beacons blinked once, then died. Across dozens of human colonies, screens filled with the same impossible message, stamped in cold blue glyphs, translated into simple words: access revoked, interstellar support suspended, compliance under review. No reason was given, no end date was promised. On Earth, the sky remained the same familiar blue, but for the first time since humanity had reached the stars, the planet felt very small and very alone. The decision had been made in a chamber older than human civilization itself, a circular hall of black stone and living light where the Galactic Council convened above a dead star. The delegates did not shout, they did not argue, they voted with quiet certainty. Humanity, they agreed, had grown inconvenient, too stubborn, too unpredictable, too willing to survive without permission. The solution was elegant in its cruelty. Do not invade them, do not fight them. Simply remove the scaffolding, cut the trade, cut the energy exchanges, cut the shared infrastructure the galaxy depended on. A species that fragile, born on a volatile death world and kept alive by machines, would collapse under its own weight. It was not punishment, it was an experiment. Ambassador Elaine Ward stood alone at the edge of the council floor as the final vote locked in. Her request to speak was denied without explanation. Around her, beings of crystal, plasma, and engineered flesh turned away, already bored. One delegate, a towering figure wrapped in a halo of gravitational distortion, paused just long enough to address her. Humans rely on systems they did not build and environments they cannot endure, it said, its voice translated into something almost gentle. When those systems fail, you will understand your place. Then it left, the chamber sealed. The star outside pulsed once and dimmed. Humanity was officially isolated. The first hours were chaos. On Mars, fusion plants designed to supplement imported antimatter fuel throttled down. In the outer colonies, food printers dependent on off-world biomatter stockpiles began flashing red warnings. Medical nanoforges went offline without their software updates. Across Earth's orbital ring, dock workers stared at empty bays where supply ships should have been. News anchors spoke in tight, controlled voices, trying not to sound afraid. Analysts predicted collapse within weeks, some said days. The galaxy had made one assumption that felt reasonable to everyone except humans. They assumed humanity had forgotten how to live without help. If you are listening to this account now, you already know how wrong they were. Stories like this are passed from one survivor to another for a reason, a reminder that when everything breaks, you find out who you really are. Some people listening might even feel that familiar tightening in the chest, that quiet thought of what they would do if the lights went out and never came back. Humanity had that thought together, all at once, and then they got to work.
On Earth, governments suspended politics and activated protocols written generations earlier and never expected to be used. The isolation archives were unsealed, filled with plans drafted by engineers who had always assumed this day might come. Factories were retooled in hours, not months. Luxury production stopped overnight. Power grids were simplified, hardened, and localized. Old technologies, once dismissed as inefficient, were pulled out of storage and brought back online because they were reliable and repairable. People volunteered without being asked.
Farmers doubled output using methods that did not depend on imported chemicals. Cities learned how to function when nothing arrived from beyond the horizon. The colonies adapted even faster. On New Anchorage, a frozen mining world where temperatures could kill in minutes, engineers shut down half their habitat to conserve power and moved everyone into the core modules. They burned furniture for heat and grew algae in recycled coolant tanks. On Redfall, a high-gravity planet abandoned by its original alien settlers, human crews stopped trying to fight the environment and started listening to it. They changed shift cycles to match tectonic rhythms. They reinforced structures with local stone instead of imported alloys. Injuries rose, deaths did not. 3 days into the isolation, the first galactic observers tuned their sensors toward human space, expecting to see panic, riots, maybe even extinction events. What they saw instead was traffic. Not ships, but movement. Energy signatures spiking and stabilizing. Communication bursts rerouted through primitive but resilient channels. Human worlds were dimmer, quieter, rougher, but they were still alive. The Council dismissed it as inertia. A species takes time to realize it is already dead. Then, on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. A human colony that should have failed went dark by choice. Every external signal ceased. From the outside, it looked like collapse. From the inside, it was camouflage. The galaxy watched one light go out and marked it as the first casualty. They did not realize it was the first lesson. Somewhere deep in human space, a council of their own was forming, not to beg for reconnection, but to decide what came next. And far beyond the edge of monitored systems, something old and very dangerous was about to notice that humanity had stopped playing by anyone else's rules. By the 7th day of isolation, the Galactic Council expected famine statistics and evacuation pleas, but what filtered through their long-range passive sensors instead was something far more unsettling. A pattern of adaptation that did not align with any known collapse model, because human worlds were not stabilizing the way dependent species did. They were changing, shedding layers of comfort and complexity like a predator stripping weight before a long hunt. And the first undeniable proof came from a backwater system no one on the Council had bothered to name, a dry world with erratic storms and a gravity well that crushed most off-world species into medical slabs within hours, a planet the humans themselves had once labeled marginal and barely worth the effort, until the galaxy cut them loose and the colony there stopped requesting aid and started broadcasting something else entirely. A raw, unencrypted transmission that slipped through background noise and found its way into black market channels. A human voice speaking calmly over the sound of wind and metal strain, explaining how they had rerouted geothermal vents with hand-built tools, how they had learned to read pressure changes in the sky to predict storms without satellites, how they lost people in the first nights and then adjusted because loss was not new to them, and how they were still standing, still breathing, still human. And that transmission spread quietly among fringe species and traders like a forbidden story, the kind you listen to once and then cannot forget. And if you're hearing this now, you already understand why people lean in closer when a voice tells you how to survive when everything else fails. The kind of story you follow because one day you might need it yourself, which is exactly why some listeners chose to keep listening, to stay connected, to not look away. Because this wasn't just about humans anymore. It was about a truth the galaxy had buried under millennia of comfort, that survival favors the adaptable, not the advanced. And while the Council dismissed the transmission as propaganda, their military analysts noticed something else. Human patrol craft, thought to be grounded without spare parts, were launching again. Not sleek and shining, but scarred, asymmetrical, patched with alloys smelted on site, and control systems stripped down to the bare essentials. Ships that could not be hacked because there was nothing left to interface with. Ships that flew without automated correction because human pilots compensated instinctively. And when one such craft drifted too close to a neutral monitoring buoy and brushed it aside without even slowing, the buoy's final data packet recorded an anomaly. Human vessels were operating with reduced life support margins that would have killed most species in minutes, and yet the crews showed no signs of distress, their heart rates elevated but controlled, their movements efficient, almost calm, as if discomfort itself had become irrelevant. And that was when the Council made its second mistake. They authorized limited pressure operations, not an invasion, just stress tests, minor disruptions in peripheral systems near human space, intended to observe failure points, because in their minds, humans were already failing and they simply wanted to measure the rate. But pressure does not break what is already hardened, it sharpens it. And the first test came when an automated defense grid belonging to a minor allied empire drifted into a human-adjacent corridor and began broadcasting warning pings that interfered with improvised human navigation routes, a problem that would have once triggered diplomatic requests and compliance delays. But now a single human frigate approached, silent, running dark, and instead of firing or retreating, it maneuvered into the grid's shadow, matched its rotation, and physically dismantled it using articulated arms and EVA crews working in vacuum and radiation without complaint. Cutting power nodes and carrying components back into their hull like scavengers, and when the Allied Empire protested, the human response was brief and unsettlingly polite. You placed equipment in our path, we removed it. No threat was made, none was needed. And that incident rippled through intelligence briefings across the galaxy because it was not aggressive, it was practical. The behavior of a species no longer asking permission to exist. And on Earth, watching these reports filtered through long-delayed channels, Ambassador Elaine Ward realized something the Council still hadn't. Isolation had not unified humanity through ideology or command. It had done something far more dangerous. It had returned them to instinct, to a shared memory written into their bones from a planet that tried to kill them every day and failed. Storms, earthquakes, predators, disease, scarcity. Humanity had never evolved to be comfortable. They evolved to endure. And as she recorded her private log, knowing no one outside human space might ever hear it, she spoke a warning meant for whoever found it later, saying, "The galaxy believes we are fragile because we build tools to soften the world, but those tools were never our strength. We are." And somewhere beyond the edge of human systems, an ancient sensor array, dormant for centuries, reactivated as it detected gravitational patterns it had not seen since the last great extinction cycle. Patterns formed not by advanced technology, but by brute force adaptation, by a species altering its behavior faster than models could predict. And the array sent a single signal into the dark, not to the Galactic Council, but to something older, something that paid attention only when prey became interesting again. And as the signal raced through cold interstellar space, humanity took its next step, not toward reconnection, but toward something the galaxy was not prepared to face. And those who hear this story now might already be forming theories, wondering where this path leads, arguing about what comes next, sharing the question with others who love tales of underestimated species and hard-earned survival. Because the truth is becoming impossible to ignore. The galaxy did not isolate a fragile civilization. It removed the leash from a Deathworld species that had finally stopped pretending it needed one. And the first true test of that realization was about to arrive from the dark between the stars.
The thing that noticed humanity did not think in terms of politics or borders or councils. It thought in cycles of consumption and silence. And when its ancient sensors traced the new patterns spreading through human space, it did not see weakness, it saw disruption. A species behaving like a variable that refused to stabilize, and that was always dangerous, because variables broke systems. And so while the Galactic Council continued debating economic forecasts and compliance projections, something far older adjusted its trajectory and began drifting toward the nearest human system, unseen, unchallenged, and completely unconcerned with diplomatic isolation. And the first hint that something was wrong reached humanity through an unlikely source. A deep space listening post powered by refurbished fission reactors and staffed by volunteers who had signed up knowing rescue would be impossible. A station built without alien components, without shared software, without the conveniences that had once defined interstellar civilization. And when their instruments picked up a distortion that did not match any known drive signature, the humans did not dismiss it as sensor error. They assumed it was real and immediately began stripping the problem down to fundamentals: mass, velocity, direction, intent. And within hours, similar readings began appearing across multiple isolated posts, forming a pattern that converged on a frontier colony barely holding together after isolation, a place where crops grew in red soil and children learned early that air was precious. And that was where the thing emerged, not with a dramatic hyperspace tear or a weapons discharge, but with silence. A patch of space where background radiation bent inward and stars dimmed as if swallowed. And the colony's warning systems, crude but honest, screamed as gravity itself began to misbehave. Structures groaned, orbiting debris shifted, and every human on that world felt the instinctive certainty that something was very wrong. And they did not wait for instructions from a central authority because there was none anymore. Instead, local commanders activated contingency plans that had never been approved by any council. Plans based on one simple rule: if something arrives that you do not understand, assume it is hostile and learn faster than it can. And they began evacuating population centers underground while launching every improvised sensor drone they had, not to attack, but to watch, to map, to understand. And what they saw chilled even veteran explorers. The object was vast, not in size alone, but in presence, a structure grown rather than built, layered with surfaces that absorbed energy and reconfigured themselves in response. And when a human drone brushed its perimeter, the drone vanished without explosion or debris, simply erased, and the data stream cut mid-packet. And at that moment, somewhere deep in human space, an emergency transmission began propagating across isolated networks. A simple alert carrying raw data and one line of analysis: unknown contact, non-council origin, non-reactive to standard probes, do not engage blindly, learn. And that message spread faster than any centralized command ever could, passed from colony to colony by human crews who had learned to trust each other without oversight. And as it spread, something unexpected happened. Human adaptation accelerated again. Engineers stopped trying to restore old systems and began designing new ones specifically to observe and survive this threat. Weapons specialists worked alongside biologists and geologists, not to build bigger guns, but to model how something like this might have evolved, because humans understood predators. They had grown up surrounded by them, studied them, hunted them, and sometimes been hunted by them. And one biologist made an observation that changed everything. This thing is not attacking randomly. It is sampling, testing responses, and that meant it was cautious, and cautious predators could be tricked. And while the Galactic Council finally noticed anomalous readings near human space and began arguing over jurisdiction, humanity made first contact without ever saying a word.
A human ship, barely more than a reinforced hull with engines and minimal shielding, drifted deliberately into the object's gravitational influence, broadcasting nothing, threatening nothing, simply existing. And when the object reacted by attempting to absorb it, the ship detonated a device that collapsed its own mass inward, not an explosion, but a controlled implosion that spiked localized gravity in a way no Council weapon ever had. And for the first time in its long existence, the ancient thing recoiled, not damaged, but surprised. Its trajectory altered, its behavior changed, and human sensors recorded the response in exquisite detail. Patterns of withdrawal, energy redistribution, adaptation. And somewhere in the data was proof that the thing could feel pressure, could be influenced, could be hurt eventually. And as the human observers processed this, a realization spread through their networks. Isolation had forced them to strip away assumptions, to think in terms of survival rather than dominance, and that mindset was exactly what this threat required. And far away, in the polished halls of the Galactic Council, a delayed report finally reached the delegates, an incomplete, corrupted transmission showing an unknown entity altering course after interacting with a human vessel. And for the first time since the isolation vote, fear entered the chamber, because the Council realized two things at once. Something ancient was moving again, and the only species that had engaged it and lived long enough to learn from it was the one they had cut off and written off as fragile. And as panic rippled through the delegates, a single question echoed unspoken in every mind. What happens when the galaxy needs humanity, and humanity remembers how it was treated? And that question would be answered sooner than anyone expected, because the ancient thing was not alone, and its reaction had sent a signal of its own, one that would draw others like it toward the only species reckless enough and resilient enough to survive the attention. And as humanity prepared for a future without allies, the galaxy stood on the edge of discovering that the Deathworld species it had abandoned might be the only one capable of standing between civilization and extinction.
The second signal arrived from a direction no one expected, not from the ancient thing itself, but from the edge of galactic civilization, where monitoring arrays designed to watch for supernovae suddenly began returning corrupted data. Stars flickering in patterns that suggested coordinated disruption rather than natural decay. And while the Galactic Council descended into frantic emergency sessions, humanity responded with something far more dangerous than panic: clarity. Because stripped of galactic infrastructure and political noise, human decision-making had become brutally efficient. Information flowed peer-to-peer, solutions were tested locally and shared instantly. And within hours, a picture emerged that the Council still could not see. The ancient entity was not a singular threat. It was a scout, a probe sent by something vast enough to harvest entire regions of space once resistance patterns were mapped. And the reason it hesitated near human space was not because humans were weak, but because they were unpredictable, and unpredictability was costly. And as this understanding spread through human networks, so did resolve. Not the loud kind, fueled by speeches, but the quiet kind, born of acceptance, the understanding that no help was coming, and that survival would depend entirely on what they could build, sacrifice, and endure together. And the first coordinated human countermeasure began not with fleets, but with worlds. Entire colonies deliberately altering their energy signatures, shutting down reactors and staggered patterns, venting heat into space to mimic lifeless systems, becoming ghosts, while others did the opposite, flaring brightly, broadcasting exaggerated activity to draw attention away from vulnerable populations. And this distributed deception worked. The ancient entity's movements grew erratic as it tried to classify targets that refused to behave consistently. And for the first time in recorded galactic history, a non-sapient, extinction-level threat was being manipulated by a species operating without centralized command or advanced alien technology.
And when one human outpost was inevitably discovered and attacked, its defenders did not attempt to hold the line in traditional fashion. They collapsed tunnels, flooded caverns, and triggered environmental chain reactions.
Reactions that rendered the world useless to the entity, while evacuating most of their people through hidden, low-signature craft, sacrificing a planet to save a population, a calculation the Galactic Council would have debated for weeks and still failed to execute. And as reports of these actions filtered through black market channels and fringe species networks, something shifted in the wider galaxy. Fear of humanity began to mix with something else. Hope, because it became clear that the humans were not just surviving, they were learning how to fight something the galaxy had no doctrine for. And that was when the Council made its third and most desperate mistake. They voted to re-establish contact, not with apologies or restitution, but with demands, insisting humanity share its data and tactics for the good of galactic civilization. And when the message finally reached Earth through a patched-together relay chain, it was received in silence, then forwarded unchanged to every human colony, station, and fleet. And the response was not immediate because humanity was busy, adapting, preparing, and choosing. And as the ancient entity's signals multiplied and distant stars continued to go dark, the galaxy waited for humanity to answer, not realizing that the species it had abandoned was no longer deciding whether to help, but on what terms, and whether a civilization that only remembered humans when extinction loomed was worth saving at all. And somewhere in the depths of human space, a plan began to form that would force the galaxy to confront that question in the most brutal way possible.
Humanity's answer did not come as a speech or a broadcast. It came as absence. Because while the Galactic Council waited for a reply and the ancient entities continued their slow, probing advance, every human signal beyond their own space went quiet at once. Not a blackout born of fear, but a deliberate withdrawal. And for the first time since the isolation began, even the black market channels carried nothing but static where human voices had once been, causing unease to ripple through species that had grown used to quietly watching humanity adapt. Because silence from a Deathworld species was never a good sign, and inside that silence something unprecedented was happening. Human colonies that had once operated independently began synchronizing without centralized orders, aligning production, migration, and defense through shared intent rather than command. People moved where they were needed without being told. Engineers dismantled entire cities to feed shipyards carved into asteroids. Families volunteered for relocation to high-risk worlds because those worlds needed settlers who could endure extremes. And soldiers stopped training for conventional warfare and began drilling for conditions no alien military would tolerate. Vacuum exposure, sustained radiation, starvation cycles, psychological isolation, because humans understood something the galaxy did not. The coming fight would not be won by superior weapons, but by superior endurance. And when the first ancient entity reached a lightly populated alien system and consumed it in hours, the Council panicked openly, sending fragmented pleas to any species willing to respond, only to discover that many had already begun copying human methods, decentralizing, hardening, preparing to survive without help. Because watching humanity had taught them a dangerous lesson: dependence was weakness. And in that growing chaos, the Council's final attempt to regain control was to send an unmanned probe into human space carrying a simple message: full amnesty, restored trade, shared defense, an offer that would have been irresistible weeks earlier, but the probe never returned. Instead, its final transmission showed a human installation unlike anything the galaxy had recorded. Not sleek or advanced, but massive, layered, brutal,
a structure grown outward from a dead moon using scavenged materials and raw force, surrounded by fleets that did not match any known human design, ships built for attrition rather than elegance. And the probe's data ended with a single audio file, a human voice speaking calmly, stating that humanity had not disappeared, it had gone inward, focusing on what mattered, and that the galaxy's offer came too late, because humans were no longer preparing to rejoin civilization, they were preparing to survive its collapse. And as the ancient entities altered course, converging not on the Council's core worlds, but on the region of space humanity now dominated through sheer resilience, a terrifying realization began to spread among alien analysts. Whatever humanity was building in that silence was not meant to save the galaxy, it was meant to endure what came after. And the question was no longer whether humans would help, but whether anyone else would be allowed to stand beside them when the final test arrived.
The first clash did not happen where anyone expected, because the ancient entities bypassed the fortified borders and struck at a minor human outpost orbiting a red dwarf star, a place the Council had dismissed as insignificant. Yet when the entities arrived, they found no panic, no evacuation, only human vessels already waiting in tight formation, engines cold, weapons silent, as if daring the invaders to come closer. And when the entities unleashed energy that had erased alien fleets in seconds, the human ships did not scatter or fire back, they absorbed it, hulls blackening, systems failing, crews dying in silence, but the formation held, and only then did the humans respond. Not with superweapons, but with proximity, ramming, boarding, detonating themselves at point-blank range, turning space into a graveyard of molten debris that slowed the entities for the first time in recorded history. Because the humans were not trying to win, they were trying to learn. Every sacrifice feeding data back through encrypted channels, every death buying seconds of understanding, and across human space, those seconds were used ruthlessly. Designs changed mid-construction, tactics rewritten before battles finished, children evacuated from frontier worlds while elders stayed behind to delay the inevitable. And the galaxy watched in horror and awe as humanity treated extinction like a solvable problem rather than a fate. Because while alien commanders begged for unified strategy, humans had already accepted the cost. And when the entities finally broke through and reached a human core system, they found something worse than resistance. They found preparation. Stars dimmed intentionally as humans collapsed solar output to hide critical worlds, planets stripped to bedrock to deny resources, entire populations living underground or in mobile habitats, adaptable, mobile, untraceable. And then came the broadcast that spread through every surviving network. A human narrator speaking as if recounting a memory, reminding listeners that humans evolved on a world where nature itself tried to kill them daily, where survival was earned through stubbornness, cooperation, and the refusal to lie down, subtly inviting those who were listening to stay, to witness, to understand, because what came next would redefine power forever. And as the ancient entities began to change tactics, adapting in response to human behavior for the first time, alien scientists realized with cold dread that humanity had done the unthinkable. It had forced evolution upon beings older than civilization itself. And if the entities learned too quickly, there would be no stopping them. But if humans stayed ahead even by a fraction, then the galaxy's future would be decided not by who was strongest, but by who could suffer longer without breaking.
The turning point came when the ancient entities attempted negotiation, a concept no one believed possible until a transmission tore through subspace. Not words, but images. Fragments of human history harvested from battlefield debris and data ghosts showing storms, predators, wars, famine, and the long, slow climb from caves to stars. And the entity's message was clear in its own cold way. They had not anticipated a species forged by constant catastrophe. They had assumed comfort-bred intelligence, not pressure, and now they sought terms. But humanity did not answer immediately, because while the galaxy watched that silence with hope, human leaders saw something else: fear, not of defeat, but of contamination, of teaching these beings too much, too fast. And so the reply, when it came, was not diplomatic, it was instructional. Humans allowed the entities to observe a single system designated as a proving ground, a place where humans did not defend planets or fleets, but ideas, where small human groups operated independently, adapting in real time, setting traps that punished prediction, sacrificing assets without hesitation, rebuilding faster than destruction could keep pace. And as the entities studied this, they began to fragment, internal disagreements forming as different segments learned at different speeds. And that fracture was the opening humanity had prepared for since isolation began. Because the real human weapon was never endurance alone. It was cooperation under chaos, the ability to act as many without losing the will of one. And when coordinated human strikes hit multiple entity segments simultaneously, exploiting their lack of unified adaptation, the ancient threat recoiled. Not destroyed, but destabilized. And the galaxy felt something shift, a sense that the invincible had finally been wounded. Yet victory did not follow, because buried within the collapsing transmissions was a final realization that froze every human analyst who saw it. The entities were not invaders, they were a containment system, an extinction filter designed to reset civilizations that grew too interconnected, too dependent. And now, by surviving them, humanity had flagged itself as something new, something the universe had never needed to account for before. And as deeper space began to stir, as signals older and larger than the entities themselves started to wake, humanity understood the terrible truth. The test was never about survival, it was about what came after. And the universe had just noticed that the Deathworld species was no longer playing by its rules.
Humanity's next move was not announced, it was executed. A quiet storm that no council, no alien empire, no ancient entity could anticipate. Because while the galaxy debated definitions of power and diplomacy, humans had already built a lattice of adaptation across hundreds of worlds, fleets that were less ships and more living strategy, populations trained to survive annihilation as casually as breathing. And when the final wave of ancient entities arrived, expecting easy conquest, they found a universe rewritten, entire sectors empty of predictable signals, decoy colonies that folded and folded again, and at the heart of it, a single human armada, not grandiose in design, not elegant, but terrifyingly precise, every vessel capable of acting independently, yet linked through instinctive coordination born of centuries of improvisation. And the first clash was not a battle, but a revelation. Entities striking with everything they had learned, and humans countering with techniques that were never meant to fight them directly, but to endure, to manipulate, to turn every advantage back on the aggressors. And as entire fleets dissolved into energy and matter loops, as systems once thought permanent shifted like sand beneath human feet, the galaxy finally understood the truth. Humans did not require technology to survive. Humans required challenge, struggle, and threat, because it was in the fire of impossibility that they became strongest. And when the last council transmission arrived, fragmented and desperate, begging for terms, humanity responded across every channel with a simple declaration: calm, firm, and irrevocable. We are not fragile, we are not weak, and we do not negotiate with those who doubt our will.
And as the words echoed through hyperspace, the surviving alien species, some fearful, some awestruck, realized that for the first time, humans were not fighting for recognition, for territory, or even for survival alone. They were fighting to define what the galaxy had never allowed itself to accept. That life born on a death world, tempered by adversity, sharpened by threat, and bound by cooperation under chaos, could never be contained, could never be predicted, and would never bow. And somewhere, deep in uncharted space, the remnants of ancient entities recoiled, not in fear of destruction, but in the dawning realization that humanity had become a force beyond extinction, beyond comprehension, and beyond any rule the galaxy had ever imagined. And as the stars themselves seemed to witness the rise of a new apex species, the message was clear to every corner of known space: underestimate humanity, and the consequences will not be survival, they will be oblivion. The storm had passed, but the galaxy would never be the same. This is humanity's declaration.